Maseches Kesubos Daf Mem contains 3 Mishnayos, and therefore 4 sugyas. The first sugya, before the first Mishnah, is discussing the halacha that an ones has to marry the woman that he's ma'anes. The Gemara wants to know why you can learn from there to mafateh. The Gemara will also talk about asay, pushing off a los asay, as far as him marrying someone who is an isser. Our first Mishnah will talk about what happens if you have a yisoma, shenis arsav, and his garsha, as far as the halachos of onus and mafateh. The Gemara will compare the two. Then we get to the sugya of boshes and pigam in the next Mishnah. Boshes and pigam, when do they have to be paid? How do you evaluate how much they are paid? And how do we know that they are different than knas? And the last Mishnah will go back to the topic we've discussed previously in this parak, and that is the subject of what age does a woman get knas, and the machlokes on that subject. So let's begin. The Gemara has seen in our previous Mishnah, we said that an ones has to marry the woman that he's ma'anes. Mafateh is not chayiv to marry. He has the option, but he's not chayiv to. The Gemara wants to know, why don't you learn from ones to mafateh that the mafateh also has to marry her? After all, we have linked ones to mafateh as far as the halacha of learning how much the knas is, that it has to be 50 and that it has to be shkalim. So we know that the two dinim are very much intertwined. So why don't we learn that he has to marry her from ones to mafateh? So the Gemara says, because you have a pasuk in mafateh which clearly says otherwise. It says mahar yemaren alayla isha. That implies that it's with his own decision. He should give her, if he wants to, the dowry, the mohar, and marry her, but he does not have to. Now the Gemara asks, we saw in the Mishnah also that if she is usher to him, there is no mitzvah to him to marry her. So the Gemara, why not? Why don't you say asay against los asay? His mitzvah asay to marry her. His mitzvah is los asay because she's someone who's usher to him. So let us say push away the los asay. So the Gemara says you only say that in a case where you can't possibly do both. You have to violate one of them, such as if you have a tzaras on a makom mila, and you have to cut off the mila, and you're not allowed to cut off tzaras. One of them you're going to have to break. The question is which one. Then you keep the essay, and you break the los essay. However, here you don't have to, because if the woman refuses, then there is no mitzvah for him to marry her. So therefore we teach the woman to refuse, because she's usher to him, and therefore both mitzvahs are fulfilled. He doesn't violate his mitzvah to marry her because he doesn't have one because she refused, and he and she don't marry each other be'isr. We now get to the first Mishnah, which lists the following halacha, which the Gemara will clarify. It says a yisoma shenis arsav and his garsha, that is an orphan girl who was engaged and divorced from the status of erison. So Rav Elazar says, here you have a split halacha. The ones, if she is a victim of ones, he has to pay her knas. If she is mafuta, then she does not get paid knas. So the Gemara says that this Rav Elazar, Rav Yochanan says, this Rav Elazar is Rav Elazar ben Shemua, who is the Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, and he's saying Rabbi Akiva's shita. Rabbi Akiva, we've seen previously, holds that a woman who is nisaris and nisgare, she's divorced from erison, she gets knas, but she gets to keep it herself. That's the same as a yisoma. Yisoma is an orphan. She also gets knas, and she gets to keep it for herself. So what the Mishnah here is saying is that these two are two separate halachos, which are the same. Two separate cases, which are the same. One is a yisoma that was nisanes, and one is a woman who was nisaris and nisgarish who was nisanes. And the reason both of them is the same. Once she has erison and a yerishin, she counts like a yisoma, and the halacha therefore is that she keeps the knas for herself. Now that explains the Mishnah. That's why the Mishnah rules that an onus has to pay her knas and a mafata does not have to pay her knas. And that's because there is no knas to a mafuta if it doesn't go to the father, because she has been mochel. She was willing participant, so she can't claim knas. That's why the mafata doesn't have to pay all these women, because they aren't getting knas and the father doesn't have any right. It's only the onus has to pay because the onus violated against her will, and therefore even though she doesn't have a father who gets it, she herself is entitled to it. The Gemara says that Yisoma would have been extra here because the logic would have been obvious from the fact that it says Nisaris and Niskarish, that the onus pays knas and the futa does not. We understand that Yisoma is extra to show that they are the same halacha, and that's so we know that this is Rabbi Akiva's shita. Now, what is the halacha? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera said the name of Rabba bar Shila, the name of Rav Menuna Saba, the name of Adabar Ava, and the name of Rav. The halacha is like this Rabbi Elazar. So the Gemara called Rabbi Elazar the most certified of Chachamim. He has all these Talmidei Chachamim saying that the halacha is like him in this scenario. Okay, now we get to our next mission, which discusses what exactly are the things that they need to pay. We said that a ones has to pay for busha, for pagam, for tsar, and knas. The mafata does not have to pay for tsar. So how do you pay these things? So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, Voshis is calculated based on who is the one that's being embarrassed and who is the one that's doing the embarrassing. Rashi says the worst one is an average person. If somebody is highly respectable that embarrasses you, it's not so embarrassing because he can embarrass anybody. You have someone who's very lowly who embarrasses you, that's pretty embarrassing because he's so low and he's still embarrassing you. It's could be viewed that way, but could also be viewed the other way, as in that, so he embarrassed me, who is he anyway? He's just a nobody, depending on the circumstance. But for an average person, he's not so low, he's not so high, it's the worst. Now, pagam, that's evaluated by how much she would reach on the slave market. That is, you calculate how much she was worth before and how much she's worth now. Rashi just fills in, as far as the misbayesh, the higher ranking someone is in society, the worse their busha is, and the more it costs to make up for it. Now, knas, so that's equal for everybody. The Torah gave a set amount of 50 shkalim. It doesn't change per person. So that's the Mishnah. The Gemara now asks, how do you know that these things are separate from Knas? Maybe Knas was meant to include the payment, maybe the 50 shkalim Knas he has to pay was meant to make up for the boshas and the pagam. How do you know that it's separate from it? It's besides it. So the Gemara is going to offer 4 approaches. So Gemara first wants to say, Rabbi Zera says, it's got to be, because otherwise the payment that's given to a victim who is a princess will be the same as a regular individual. They both get the same 50 shekel knas, and it's not fair to say that the pagam or the busha that they suffer is the same. It's obviously very different. If she's a princess, the busha is much greater. So it couldn't be that she gets the same thing as a regular person. And therefore, it's got to be that the 50 shekel knas is separate from the pagam and from the boshas, which is calculated on a scale depending on how severe it is. So Abaye rejects this. Abaye says it can't be, because you should say the same thing by an eved who receives knas. If somebody's cow gores an eved, so there is a payment of knas. There's a 30 shekel knas that is paid. Now you should have the same claim. How could that be equal for everybody? What if the guy had a very highly skilled craft? What if he was a jewelry stringer? He would string pearls on a string. That's very different than somebody who was something else, who was a tailor. So how could you say that the knas payment is the same? Yet we do. We say that it is the same. So obviously that's not a claim. That's not a logic. So the Gemara therefore says, the Rabbi Zera gives a different svara. Rabbi Zera says, what happens if a woman was nasanes by 2 different people, one in a normal way and one shelo kedarka? Then the boshas has to be different, because the pagam has to be different, because one was untouched before and one already had a pagam before there was a second pagam. So you're going to say that it's the same pagam? Obviously the pagam, the damage that happens to someone who has never had anything happen to them, is much more severe than one who already was, in some extent, can be termed damaged already up till now. So Abaye says, you have the same taina. We have the 30 shekels that's given to an eved. How are you going to tell me that the pagam is the same? What if the eved was a mukash shchin? What if the eved was healthy? It's not the same pagam. The value is obviously different before, and therefore the 30 shekels should be different. Logically, then that shows that we don't care. You don't have to have a sliding scale. It can be the same. So the Gemara therefore gives a different shot, and it's Abaye gives his own shot. Abaye says it's not based on any logic of it has to be different for different people. Abaye says the reason is just because you have a pasuk that says Tachas Asher Ina, that the payment of the 50 shekel kanas is given for an ina. It's given for the fact that he oppressed her. That would have to be different than pagam and avoshes, which is something you pay to anytime you injure someone, even if there's no ina, even if there's no oppression, even if it wasn't a beer that's involved. So that has to be separate from this, which was only for the ina. Now Rava gives a different shot. Rava says you have another pasuk. It says kesef. It's because of shochev ima. It's because he lay with her. So the payment is a restitution for the hana that he took from her of the lying with her. But the boshes and pagam is not included. That's a separate thing, and therefore you cannot include that in that at all. Now the Gemara says, okay, good, I understand. And now I have another question. Boshes and pagam is paid to the father of the nara. Why is it to the father? I understand kanas is to the father, but maybe boshes and pagam should go to the nara herself. So Gemara brings a pasuk. It says, "Benurah beisavia." Any monetary accrual to a nara goes to her father. Anything which is benurah goes to beisavia. Now that pasuk is written by Nidarim, where it says that a father has the right to be meifir the Nidarim. The Gemara wants to apply it all over. So when I ask it can't apply all over, I'll prove to you that it doesn't apply all over, because we have a different pasuk to teach that a father gets his daughter's wages. Why don't you just learn it out of Ne'urel Beis Avia? The pasuk we use for that is because it says Kiyim Kar Eshes Bita La'ama. Bita is linked to Amma, just like he gets the income of his Amma, of his maidservant, he also gets the income of his daughter. So the two are linked there. But why do we need that pasuk if you could just say Benurel Beis Avia, all profits from being a nara go to the father? So obviously then that's not a source for everything. That only applies to nidarim. It doesn't apply to other things at all. And that's why we need the pasuk here, so you can't use that. So says the Gemara, so maybe you could learn from nidarim to boshes and pagam. I see over there the value, the nara is considered to be in the rishos of her father. So here also, we'll just make a mamatzinu from there to here. So the Gemara says you can't do that. We have a rule, mamona me'isur lo yofina. We don't learn halachos of monetary things from halachos of iser. Nedarim is a sugya of iser, whether or not the iser that she made on herself, the neder, whether or not that's chal. You can't learn from there to this, which is discussion of monetary value. Says the Gemara, maybe you learn from kanas. Kanas goes to the father, so learn from kanas to boshes and pagam that it goes to the father. So the Gemara says you can't. Mammon from kanas is not learned. They're both financial, but mammon is a repayment for something. It's a restitution. Kanas is not a restitution for anything. It's just punitive. So you can't learn restitutions from punitives. So says the Gemara, the source, therefore, is the way we know that the money for boshes and pagam goes to the father is because the father has a right to cause her boshes and pagam. He has a right to marry her off to whoever he wants. He can marry her off to a menovel, a mukas shchin, and he has a right that would cause her tremendous busha, and it also causes her tremendous pagam because he can marry off for kiddushay ibiyah. Since he has a right to do that, he therefore, in a sense, owns her boshes and pagam, and he gets the payment for it. Okay. Now, the Gemara says, how do we evaluate pigam? How do you evaluate how much it's devalued? So we said that however much she's devalued on the slave market. The Gemara says it doesn't make a difference to the slave market whether she's a bu'u or a psula. People will pay the same. She works just as hard. So the Gemara says, no, there is a difference because someone may want to buy a shifcha to marry her off to his eved. So Gemara says again, what do we care about bu'ul or psula? Either way, she's just as suitable to be a wife. So Gemara says no, it could be that he wants to do his eved a favor. You have an eved who worked very well and he caused a lot of benefit to his master as a way of repaying him. He wants to give him a wife who's a psula. So he's willing to therefore pay more for a psula than he is for a ba'ula. All right, now we get to our last Mishnah. The Mishnah brings up a topic we've seen earlier, which is what age gets kanas. We've seen that it's a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. The Gemara here, this Mishnah is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as the Gemara will point out, and the Gemara will quote our whole previous Gemara again. So this Mishnah says that there are two things to figure out when the father has the rights, and that's knas and mecher, the right to get the knas that is owed to his daughter because of onus or mefate, and mecher is the right to sell her as an amma. So Rabbi Meir says they are mutually exclusive. A ketana can be sold, a nara cannot, and a ketana does not earn knas, and a nara does. As far as bogeres, the Mishnah says she never gets either. She can't be sold, and she has no knas. So Gemara points out, Yehuda says, this is the opinion of the Chachamim, but this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that is, but the Chachamim say a ketana does have a right to kanas, and it goes to the father. The Gemara quotes the Brisa, which we've seen earlier. According to Rabbi Meir, a ketana from 1 day old until she brings 2 hairs, which is until she becomes a nara, she can be sold, and she gets no kanas. From when she brings 2 hairs until she becomes a bogeres, she has kanas, and she cannot be sold. And that's again Rabbi Meir. And the Brisa spells out, because Rabbi Meir holds that anytime you can be sold, there's no kanas. Anytime there's kanas, you can't be sold. And the Chachamim disagree. The Chachamim say that it goes, first of all, from 3 years old and up, not from 1 day old, but from 3 until she becomes a bogeres. She has knas. Mar says she has knas. She can't be sold. No, she can be sold, and she additionally has knas besides for that. All right, now the Gemara wants to go into the reasons here. So the Gemara asks, what is Rabbi Meir's reason? How does he know that they're mutually exclusive? There is no knas for a katana. The Gemara says because it's velosia leisha. She marries him. It's only if she's willingly able to marry herself, that's where we can apply the pasuk of she should marry him. If she's a katana, she's not in her own rishus to do marriages. You couldn't say velosia leisha on that. Says the Gemara, there's what is the source of the Chachamim? How are they going to disagree with that? So the Gemara says, because when the Torah says nara here, it spells it without a hey. It just nun ayin reish, and it's pronounced nara. So Rish Lakish says, anytime it says nara, that if it's spelled without a hey, that implies a ketana as well as a nara. Now, Rav Papa, Breda of Hanan, heard this sugya. He said it over in front of Simi Bar Ashi, and he said, we have that statement of Rava said elsewhere. We have that limud about nara without a hey, talking about a motzi shemra. There's a whole parsha of someone who's accused, a woman who's accused of not being a psula. Her husband is motzi shemra against her. And the halacha over there is that it applies only to a nara and up, not to a katana. Katana does not have that sugya, so what's the source for that? So there, Rish Lakish says, because anytime the Torah says nara without a hey, it means katana. Here it says nara with a hey, and that's specifically to exclude katana, and therefore the parsha of Moshe Shemra does not apply to katana. Now the Gemara has a problem with this version, and that's that I don't need this source, because the halacha of this woman, this Motzi Shemra, is that if it's true, she really was unfaithful, she gets misa, she gets skila. Katana can't get skila. There are no onshin, there are no punishments meted out to a katana, and therefore this entire parsha can't be referring to katana at all. So I don't need nara with a hey to teach me that it's talking about a real nara and not a katana. So therefore you have to say that the correct version of this Gemara is the other way around. The source that nara without a hey means a katana is included is from here. And here it does not mean a katana is included. We know that because she can't get punishments, and you see that the Torah here spells nara with a hey. Obviously the Torah is revealing to us here that the term nara with a hey does not include a katana, and from there we learn that the term nara without a hey will include katana, and that's the support for the sugya which we said before as far as onus and kanas.